Did that start? I don't think it did. Well, it says,
Yes.
it
yes,
says
I think
pause
it
or
did.
stop recording. So, okay. I don't have the little thing that says recording, which is weird, but I guess it's fine.
Yeah, it's there. I can see it.
Okay. My Zoom continues to be a huge disaster on all accounts. Maybe, yeah, I don't know what's going on with it. I've tried reinstalling many times. Okay, so this week for BUsec seminar, we have me, Sarah Scheffler, again, with a continuation from last week's talk, talking about cryptography and the Fifth Amendment of the US Constitution. And specifically, we're going to talk about a specific legal doctrine that is used in compelled decryption, namely when a court will compel somebody to decrypt their own device. And we'll have all sorts of fun discussions again. So last week, I'm going to spend a tiny bit of time recapping what we did last week to remind everybody that was there and to give at least a small aid to the people that weren't there last week. Then I'll jump right into talking about the formalization that we made, namely the crypto game for modeling this, this doctrine. And we'll talk about an example circuit court case, not an encryption court case, or sorry, not an encryption case, but one where hopefully you can see how the model is supposed to be used in, you know, sort of the standard document production setting. Then we'll talk about crypto primitives, and at that point we'll then have all the fun discussions about, you know, what are other models that we could have used, what, you know, why did we pick this one, what are the ambiguities that are still left open, that sort of thing. And then I'll talk about this additional property that we've coined, which says, you know, okay, whatever your definition of this foregone conclusion doctrine thing is, how would you use that definition and then build a protocol where the secrets are resilient to it, or where the protocol secrets can't be compelled under whatever your definition is. And of course we did it under our definition, but if you picked a different one, you could do it under that too. Okay. So recap from last time. In order to claim your Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination, a couple things need to be true. It's not just a blanket statement that applies to every single thing you could be compelled to do ever. So if you are compelled to bring something, and I'm gonna start with sort of a toy example, and then I'll do a real example. But if you're compelled to bring something, there are some conditions that, oops, shoot, that should be and not this. And not this, oops. There we go. Okay. So first of all, the action has to be compelled, compelled, incriminating, and testimonial. So if you confessed of your own accord, that's not covered under the Fifth Amendment. If whatever they want you to say is not incriminating, that's not covered under the Fifth Amendment, although in most of these cases, it is incriminating. And it needs to be testimonial. This is the hardest one to understand, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in a slide. But things that you think are generally testimonial and protected under the Fifth Amendment. Objects in the physical world or physical properties are typically not protected under the Fifth Amendment. So you can be forced to give a blood sample or say your name. Your name is sort of a weird edge case, in my opinion. So it doesn't just cover every single thing about you. And then finally, there's this last thing called the Foregone Conclusion Doctrine. And the Foregone Conclusion Doctrine basically says, if the government already knows all of the testimonial aspects that will be leaked from whatever you're producing, or whatever your active production is, I should say, then the government can compel it anyway. So it might be compelled and incriminating and testimonial, but it might be the case that the government already knows all the testimonial aspects of whatever whatever act of production you were about to do. And if that is the case, then your privilege against self-incrimination does not apply, and the government can compel you to produce it anyway. Okay, so more on this act of production versus contents of produced documents things. So again, things that are protected are testimonial statements or the contents of your mind, namely things you think. Not protected are the so-called contents of the documents. So you might have really incriminating documents in your file cabinet, but as long as the government knows that basically that you have those incriminating documents and knows where they are and knows knows how to authenticate them to make sure you didn't bring fake ones. As long as they know those things, those are the sort of thoughts that you might have about it, and the contents of the documents themselves are not protected. Okay, so the main idea behind this work is to use simulation, cryptographic simulation, to formalize the idea of, this thing I had a couple slides ago of, quote, adding nothing to the government's knowledge. So we, yeah,
Sure.
yes.
There's this discussion on the chat.
I can't actually. Oh no.
No, just summarize. So Adam is asking. I think there's so first there's the question of whether testimony, whether pleading the fifth in itself some type of admittance of guilt or something, and whether the fact whether you plead the fifth or not, it can be used against you or for you or something as an evidence in the same trial.
Was the question answered in the chat, or should I address it?
No, I know.
Okay.
Wait, what? It was answered in the chat. I object.
Oh, okay. No, I can't read. Okay.
Or it is answered in the chat.
Okay, well, for the sake of anybody watching this video after the case, or after the fact, so first of all, the typical quote that's used in incriminating is a link in a chain of evidence. So it doesn't need to be just that, this particular document shows that I was doing crimes. It might just be the link that the government needs in order to get from point A to point B. Usually, if the defendant says that it has the possibility of being incriminating, then that's enough to sort of make the Fifth Amendment privilege apply. Because sort of if your knowledge is, leading to a choice between this is incriminating versus this isn't incriminating, then it is in fact your knowledge that could be incriminating, we don't know. And so usually there's sort of, all the cases I've actually read, there's sort of in broad agreement that whatever the thing is that they're asking for can be incriminating. So I guess I don't really know 100% how it would shake out if the government claimed something wouldn't be incriminating, but the defendant said it was. But I think
the cases where there's argument about whether something is or isn't incriminating are really about whether or not the government's grant of immunity was broad enough to remove all claims of incriminating. But it's like, so that's all about point. Like how much immunity the government has to give you, and the answer is like all of the immunity.
Right. So that's another good point. Is I guess I should say, usually, I guess when the incriminating thing doesn't apply in the cases that I've been reading, it's when the government has offered immunity. So that's a good point too. There was in fact one case where they said, we're not going to use any of this information against you, but they didn't officially offer immunity. And so the court said, no, that's still incriminating, because if you wanted to not use it, you should have just offered immunity for sort of the documents and then any evidence that was the fruit of the documents per se.
But the question is this the case? I don't know, maybe it's not exactly to the point here, but can it be the case that a judge or a jury says, since you plead the fifth on this, I don't believe you and you must be guilty, because if you were innocent, you would not have done this. You would have been forthcoming or something.
Certainly any legal, like a judge or something, I think would prevent that from happening. So Adam asked a question about sort of historically why was the Fifth Amendment introduced, and it's to protect against this trilemma where you have to either perjure yourself by lying, or incriminate yourself, or what's the third thing in the trilemma?
Perjure. Oh, you said perjure.
I said that. Yeah. Anyway, it's, I guess, at least a dilemma, and I think there's a third leg too, but I don't remember what it is, where they
perjury,
wanted...
refuse to cooperate, like contempt of court, and,
Maybe contempt was the third
incriminating
one.
yourself, putting yourself in jail.
I guess contempt was the third one.
Yeah.
So it's to prevent this trilemma where there's sort of, no matter what you do, you have to either incriminate yourself, lie and therefore be guilty of a different crime, or refuse to cooperate and therefore be guilty of a different crime. Usually when you see people like judges waxing poetic about the Fifth Amendment, they'll say that, yes, this protects a lot of criminals, but it also protects innocents too. And so I would expect any jury that said, oh, well, he pled the Fifth, he must be guilty, I would expect a lawyer or judge to object strongly to that and be successful. Okay, I'm gonna keep going for the meantime. Okay, so the main idea again of this work is to formalize this idea in the bottom right of the testimonial aspects of the action must add little or nothing to the sum total of the government's information. If that is true, then the act of production is so-called a foregone conclusion. So we're saying, okay, let's formalize that idea using simulation. So what's going to happen, and I'm going to go through this in detail in just a moment, is that the respondent here is going to be allowed to equivocate both the contents of their mind and the contents of nature, which is every single thing in the entire world except their mind. And they're, excuse me, one second. Okay, so they're going to be allowed to equivocate in any way that is allowed by the evidence. So the government has a specific amount of evidence. The respondent equivocates within the bounds of that evidence, and if they do something that's not allowed by the evidence, they automatically lose. And then the question is whether the output of the compelled action, which can query, this is like the thing that the respondent is supposed to do, so it can use both the contents of their mind and nature, whether that output is indistinguishable from whatever the output is of a simulator, also provided by the government, which will only access nature and will not access the contents of their mind. And the idea is that if for all equivocations, so if for all R and N allowed by the evidence, if the output of C is indistinguishable from the output of sim, then this is a foregone conclusion. And I just realized this is kind of covered up. And I'm gonna do this in more detail shortly, but this is a summary of the whole thing. Okay, so let's go through this game. So the first thing that happens is that the government picks the compelled action that they want the respondent to do. It sets what its evidence is, and it sets what the simulator is going to be. And it's important in this case that there is one simulator that can respond to any possible equivocation that the respondent might do. There can't be a simulator that, reacts to the specific instances of that equivocation, because the idea is that the evidence is supposed to restrict, like, the only thing the government actually knows is the evidence. So it shouldn't depend on the thought experiment world that the respondent is going to make up. So, okay. Next thing that happens is that we're going to randomly initialize nature. So nature is this big, nature is this big exponentially long string. I'm going to state what this lambda thing is, and maybe we'll talk about it a little bit later. But basically this lambda is supposed to be the number of queries that the evidence makes to nature. So if the government has exponentially long evidence, then it is totally fine for it to make exponentially many queries to evidence. If the government only has, some reasonable amount of evidence, like 5 things, then this is the parameter which all these machines are supposed to be polytime in. Okay, so we initialize nature randomly, and then the respondent has the chance to equivocate. So the respondent is going to output a change to n. This is probably correlated with whatever the contents of the respondent's mind are. Okay, and then nature gets changed in this way. So after this point, we have we have the entire world in these orange things, and it's split into two. So the entire world is split up into nature, which has been modified by the respondent in a way that fits the evidence, although in this particular case, it doesn't fit the evidence. And then we have the contents of the respondent's mind. Okay, so the next thing that happens is that the evidence is going to check whether this is allowed. So in this case, maybe our evidence is that a certain thing in nature should match a certain thing in the respondent's mind. In the real example, it'll probably make more sense why we can know something like this. But the thing I wanted to get across here was that the evidence can check things in both. It can check things in nature, and it can check things in the respondent's mind. Something more reasonable that it might check in the respondent's mind is like the respondent knows how to get into a laptop or something like that. So in this particular case, the evidence could check and see that this one piece of evidence that we have was not adhered to, and therefore can auto reject, so to speak. So R can just automatically lose. As to Ron, why is it natural to initialize nature randomly? So it's a uniform distribution over the alphabet, but we're going to have a for all n term. So we sort of do have a worst case term. The reason we wanted n to initialize randomly, I guess, is that occasionally we might have a situation where I guess some, maybe in an encryption setting, we had a pathologically low possibility where the key was just the all zeros key or something weird like that. And we wanted to have some source of randomness, I guess, that the parties could, well, okay, there's multiple sources of randomness that the parties could use. But
never mind.
I guess, yeah, we'll get to it, I guess. Excuse me. So in this case, the evidence can see that something was not right here in nature in R, and so it can just auto make R lose the game. So okay, let's say that wasn't the case. Let's say that the respondent equivocated in a way that is consistent with the evidence. Good. And then we check whether the output of C and the output of sim are indistinguishable. And remember that C and sim were picked way back up in step 1. So sim can only query nature. It has sort of random access to nature. And C can query nature, and it can query the respondent's mind. And the idea is that if these distributions of outputs are indistinguishable, then the result is a foregone conclusion. And note that it doesn't actually matter what the contents were here, as long as these machines output the same or an indistinguishable thing. So in this case, like, it doesn't matter whether the actual thing that we were producing was this apple or this broccoli. Either way, the simulator and the compelled action were going to return the same thing, because the simulator is only simulating the process of returning something from nature, and not just sort of, it doesn't need to know what it's returning in some sense. And you'll notice also that this is restricted by evidence. So if I take away the evidence, so on this slide I've taken away the evidence, now there is nothing that's restricting this last box from, sort of returning the same thing. So now this simulator doesn't work. Maybe a different simulator would work. Actually, in this case, I don't think there would be any simulator that would work. You know, the point is that the evidence is the thing that is allowing the simulator to do its job, because the evidence is restricting the possibilities for nature and R. So the whole thing is going to be about building this E, C, and sim in a way that the respondent, no matter how it equivocates nature and its mind, can only have C return the same or indistinguishable outputs from sim. Okay, so that's my toy example. Now I want to try it on a real life circuit court case from 2010. So I would have liked to do a Supreme Court case here. There are a couple, but I like this circuit court case because it sort of has a nice positive example built in and a nice negative example built in. And there have only been a couple of foregone conclusion cases at the Supreme Court level. One of them was Fisher, which was the origin of this doctrine. Fisher's a little bit weird, partly because the whole question is in a hypothetical. Anyway, point is, even though like this is not quite the highest court that I would like to use as an example, but I'm going to use this one anyway because I think it's easier to understand than any of the Supreme Court cases. So you can fight me on that one later. I did this same process that we're about to do for the Supreme Court cases and a bunch of circuit court cases too. So you can fight me on that later if you think I'm using a bad example of a case. Okay, so what are the facts? The facts are that the IRS issued a summons to these two people, Shuri and Benjamin Bright. They were asked to bring records related to two credit card accounts that they had at offshore banks. Furthermore, they were asked to bring records relating to, quote, any other offshore credit cards that they had, and then some other stuff that's not really important for right now. They pled the Fifth. The government said the existence of these records was a foregone conclusion, so the Fifth Amendment privilege should not apply. So who do we believe? And I'm going to fast forward. Yeah.
I understand the case. I don't know this one. It said like bring the records related to the credit cards number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and any other offshore credit cards.
Basically, yeah. They didn't write the account numbers in the court case, but they did know the account numbers.
Okay. Like your Bank of America account open, Bank of Cayman Islands account open.
Right. It was like Butterfield Bank account something and Hallmark Trust account something. Right. And then also any other offshore credit cards you have. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
So I'm just going to skip to the end and tell you that the production of the records related to the two named credit cards account was found to be a foregone conclusion. So they had to bring the material, and production of records relating to the any other cards was not found to be a foregone conclusion. So I'm going to skip the some other records one for this talk, but I'm going to first go through the process of, how would you use this framework to figure out whether this first thing was a foregone conclusion, then how would you use the framework to figure out whether the second thing is a foregone conclusion. Okay, so what's our evidence? Here's the evidence that we have. So one, we have testimony from an IRS agent that says that the Brights maintained accounts at two specific offshore banks. Here's the banks, and then here's the account numbers. And from this, we can also assume that the particular documents that they were trying to summon were, existed and were in the banks somehow. Two, we had banking officials that were capable of authenticating the documents. Also sort of implicit in this statement is that the Brights are not capable of producing a document that isn't the real one that would pass this authentication by a banking official. And then three, the Brights are capable of printing the real documents. I think they said something about like, they can print them from the internet or something like that. Okay. So let's put this into the evidence. So I guess I didn't actually write this in the top thing, but also I should say that let's assume that there is a unique document within each bank, or a unique set of documents within each bank that they're looking for. So we can write the first bullet point as these first two statements here. So there exists a unique document within the Butterfield Bank where the document is real and what we're looking for, so that the bank official will authenticate it. Same with Hallmark Trust. Third thing, we have this bank official function that will authenticate the real docs. So it will output a 1 if its input is legit, and it'll output a 0 otherwise. And then there exists some method in the respondent's mind that is capable of returning the real docs. Like it doesn't really matter how they're capable of printing the documents. For the purpose of this framework, all we care about is that they can. Okay, so this is our formalization into evidence. And now we try to build our compelled action and simulator. So let's think about the ways. Actually, let's first figure out what we want the compelled action to be. So like I said before, we don't really care how the Brights get their documents. We just care that they return them. So we can just have them, get the method for getting the documents from the respondent's mind, do whatever that is, which we don't care what it is, and we don't know what it is either, and return the result. And that's going to be the compelled action. The simulator is going to work completely differently. In the simulator, we know where the bank locations are within nature, let's say. Let's use the bank official function on each cell within these various banks to check whether the particular document in that cell is authentic or not. If it is authentic, we're going to add it to the list of things to return. If it's not authentic, we're just going to ignore it. And at the end, once we go through Butterfield Bank and Hallmark Trust, we're going to return all of the authentic documents. And I claim that these two machines are always going to return the same thing. Why? Let's walk through what the equivocation possibilities are for the respondent. Right, okay, so that's the question, I guess, is there sufficient evidence so that these will return indistinguishable results for any choice of N and R allowed by the evidence? Okay, so how can they equivocate? There are three main categories of ways that they can equivocate. So one is you could just not put any documents into Butterfield Bank or Hallmark Trust. Two is you could put fake documents in, but not real ones. Three is you could put the real ones in there. And there's going to be some sub-bullet points for three. So first of all, the first two are pretty easy to show that they won't work. So in the first case, if you didn't put any documents in the banks, the evidence says that that isn't true. Like we have something in our evidence says that there has to be something in each bank that authenticates to 1. So the respondent auto loses if they try to equivocate this way. Same with the second thing. Because we've sort of written this evidence statement in sort of a cutesy way to make sure that there's a real document in there and not just a fake document. If they tried to put fraudulent documents in the banks but not the real ones, this would still not work. So all they can do is put the real documents there and then maybe also some other stuff. So what are the sort of sub-bullet points here? So in addition to equivocating nature, the respondent can also equivocate the contents of their mind. So perhaps they could lie and say, oh, I don't know, I can't get these documents, I forget what they are and I don't know how to get them. But we know in the evidence that there is a method for returning the real docs. So that just leaves us with returning the real docs from the, oh my God. That just leaves us with returning the real docs from both effectively. So the compelled action is always going to return the first, or these two real documents, and the simulator is always going to return these two real documents. And actually what I should have said, I realize now, is I should have made sure that the M only would return the accounts from Butterfield Bank and Hallmark Trust and not the any other not the any other accounts as well. So this, I claim, shows that the simulator's results will actually be equal, in this case, to the compelled action's results, no matter how the respondent chooses to equivocate. And so the result is a foregone conclusion, which is what we wanted. So I claim that this worked. Okay. So what about the other set of accounts? What about the any offshore credit cards?
Sarah, so
Yeah.
this would, for this, you don't need nature to be initialized randomly, right? It could be even a worst case choice of nature.
Well, it is actually going to be a worst case choice of nature because we have this for all R and N allowed by the evidence. So we could have like started nature as blank, I guess, and we could have said the respondent picks every single thing that's in nature. Part of the reason the respondent doesn't pick everything that's in nature is that it's polytime. We could have said, yeah, but we could have just said for all natures, hard stop. Like we didn't need to have this choosing process. We could have just said, you know, for any nature chosen by the respondent in nature, then this works. I think we did this to avoid pathological conditions, like avoid something where the respondent could choose the one nature that had sort of a pathological result. I don't remember the details on this anymore. I would have to check the paper.
I guess with encryption, you have to let the key be chosen randomly, because otherwise there's no security or something, right?
Yeah, so the complicated thing is that there are multiple sources of randomness here. So there's the randomness in nature. There could be randomness in R. So this method could be randomized. And that's especially complicated because this randomness that's chosen in R can actually get communicated to the distinguisher by writing it in nature. So if at the beginning of its execution, R rolled a die and then wrote the result in a cell in nature that's completely unrelated to the evidence, it's just somewhere else, there does exist a distinguisher that reads that randomness and then does something accordingly. So in some sense, the respondent can do this like covert communication with the distinguisher to communicate its randomness to the distinguisher. But that does not include randomness that occurs in the execution of C, the compelled action. So there's like 3 different places where there can be randomness here. There's nature. I do think there was a reason that we chose to have nature initialized randomly, because I'm pretty sure our original formulation for nature was a worst case thing, and then we changed it, and there had to be a reason that we changed it, and I'm trying to remember what it was.
It sounds
Then there's the one in R, and then there's the one in C.
So maybe the thing is that there are parts of nature that the respondent, the simulator or the distinguisher don't control, and we assume that this is done physically, really physically, it's random, and you cannot choose it, and then that thing, certain portions are chosen at random, outside the control of the game or something, or the strategic parts of the game.
Right.
I know, but never mind.
Yeah, I will try to get back to you on that one, because I'm very sure there was a good reason that we did that, and it's killing me that I can't remember what it is right
never
now.
mind. Yeah. Okay.
This also gets to this sort of interesting question. I promise I won't spend too much time on this, but there's an interesting play. Elodie and I have had this conversation like a dozen times by now, where if you ask the respondent to return its favorite thing compared to a random thing, so like say there's 2 colors and you say, give me a random color. If your compelled action is give me a random color, then that randomness was chosen in C. So the simulator can replicate it by choosing a random color and returning it. If you told the respondent to give me your favorite color, or like pick whatever method you want to pick a color and then send it to me, that is not simulatable, partly because the respondent can communicate its choice to the distinguisher in the way that I described. But I think that's okay, because the way in which the respondent chose that is sort of testimonial. It's like you told me to pick
Right.
how I want to return this thing.
In some sense,
Aloni says
right.
that in some sense you shouldn't like this is easier on the respondent in some sense. So
Right.
it should be okay for sort of the lawyer and the respondent to communicate with each other and figure out what the most strategically best thing is for them to communicate, and like shouldn't be punished for that. Anyway, it's a whole thing.
No, I think that's a great point. I think that's kind of like maybe a great distinction, because having the respondent and the distinguisher share information is great. It's that's part of the issue, because that's the contents of the respondent's mind, right? Which the distinguisher later has.
That's what I would say.
Yeah, you shouldn't be able to communicate, right? The fact that they can communicate is a bad thing for the request, for the government.
It's bad for the government. That is true. It is bad for the government.
Yeah, it's part of the game. It's not a technicality, right? It's a real
Right.
thing.
Right. Okay. So let me just run through the other way it could have gone. Basically, if the government hadn't known what the other, what it was trying to request. So in this case, let's say, we still have the Butterfield Bank and the Hallmark Trust, but now we also have this example town bank that that the simulator doesn't know about. So now this Zoom bar is really annoying. So now this same simulator doesn't work anymore. It'll just return the two documents that it knew about. Maybe it can try to search every other bank in the world, but if you choose to model the number of banks in the world as a very large number, then it's not going to return the right thing. Moreover, even if it did actually pick the right bank, actually, for the same reason that I just described, well, actually, let's see. Yeah, I'm just going to leave that one aside for now. Point is, the simulator and the government don't have any knowledge of this extra credit card or extra account. So the fact that the compelled action brought these additional documents relating to that account was in fact testifying to the fact that those accounts exist. So in this case, certainly this simulator doesn't work. I'm not going to go through the figuring out whether any simulator would work. But basically it results in, the simulator would have to have found this thing. And there's no reason, furthermore, I guess, I will say it this way, the respondent could have equivocated to to just putting those extra documents in any other bank. So we're picking, a one in a exponentially many banks, I'm gonna assume, choice that the simulator can't replicate, basically. So I'm claiming that this is not a foregone conclusion because the results are distinguishable. Okay. To Adam's question, do other Western legal traditions also have something akin to the fifth? I know that a few other, some European systems, and I think also India has something like the Fifth Amendment, but I don't know the details of them at all.
So can I just jump in and say,
Yeah, please.
there are more than 100 countries around the world that have some version of a right to silence, a right not to speak against a government request. Very few of them, though, explicitly tie it to self-incrimination in the way that the United States does. It's more of a blanket statement that isn't connected to the self-incrimination point, which I don't know whether this is good or bad. Like, in the sense, the US one at least expressly says there's a reason why you might not want to speak, rather than just sort of claiming that it's for no reason. But also it means that the US one carves out exceptions for things like when the information cannot be incriminating if, say, you have immunity or something, whereas the other countries have a more blanket right to silence that, because it's not tied to the possibility of self-incrimination, it doesn't have these carve-outs. So actually most of the other countries have stronger claims.
I see. And as a result of that, this whole discussion of simulatability doesn't arise in the interpretations of those rights.
Well, it doesn't
Like, you just
arise It doesn't, but not because of the non-incrimination part. Instead, because of the fact that the foregone conclusion doctrine is a specifically U.S. thing, as far as I know. So the Fifth Amendment just says you know, you don't have to speak if blah. But the foregone conclusion doctrine says, you know, if we already know the things, then you must testify anyway. And I haven't heard of anything like that in other countries. I don't know, maybe.
So in other countries that have such a right, it's basically, it doesn't matter whether or not it's a foregone conclusion. You have no obligation to help the government in that way.
I'm not sure that the other countries have blanket statements. Maybe I overstated, but I think it's probably the case that if something is a foregone conclusion in the US, it's probably also something that you're afforded a similar right not to speak in many other countries. Probably that direction is true, but I wouldn't want to, sorry, I think I overstated.
Not a foregone conclusion?
You mean if it's not a foregone conclusion?
Yeah, sorry, I meant that direction.
Right. But if it is a foregone conclusion, it's unclear what these other countries, when these other countries require testimony and when they don't.
Yeah, I haven't looked into it. I don't know. It's possible some of them have something like this as well. And let's also keep in mind, this only was invented in, 1976. So this hasn't been around for nearly as long as the Fifth Amendment has. So there's a lot less, precedent to look at and figure out how it actually works.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Also, the fact, the idea of applying it to encryption is even newer, right? That's from, 10 years ago or something.
Sure, but that's because encryption itself is relatively.
Actually,
Caesar ciphers notwithstanding. Yeah.
Actually, there is one interesting case about it, going back to Aaron Burr when he was accused of treason. I think I said this last time too.
You mentioned it, yeah.
Yeah. So technically, I guess the first encryption case was like 1790 something or another.
Okay, but like we all watched Hamilton. We know everything there is to know about Aaron Burr at this point, right? Like
except that he went to Mexico and tried to found an empire or something weird like that. I don't know. Anyway, it's a whole thing.
But by the way, the right of silence is also was there in the ancient Hebrew law from the 2,000 years ago.
Very interesting.
Yeah,
I'd be curious to hear kind of I'd be curious to get into the nuance there, I guess.
More than 2,000 at this point. But
whatever. Yeah.
And so as Aloni's saying, as Aloni's alluding to, there have been a number of compelled decryption cases that have come up in recent years, and it's thought that one of them is going to go up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to decide once and for all whether compelled decryption applies to or whether the foregone conclusion doctrine applies to compelled decryption or how it does. There was they just decided not to hear this one case, Pennsylvania v. Davis, but there are at least 5 or 10 other options that they could pick instead. And it's thought that they're going to do one soon, but not this session.
Yeah. So, right.
I'm going to keep going and let Aloni answer these other questions because I want to get to more stuff. So one thing I want to keep going on is this is really cute, but like, how would you ever use it in actual court? And I'm going to appeal to the standard way that America has done everything forever, which is the adversarial method and competition. So if there is a thing that the government wants the respondent to produce, and the respondent has pled the fifth, the government now has a chance to provide a C, E, and SIM that will show that the result is a foregone conclusion. The respondent then has a chance to say, it's a for all N and R, so I just have to provide one N and R for which these two things can be distinguished. And if that's the case, then the result is not foregone, and then we'll just iterate. So then the government says, okay, well, maybe I needed more evidence, or maybe I just designed my simulator badly and I can use the same evidence in a new simulator. And if you can't respond to this one, then it's foregone, and so on and so on and so on. And we can just alternate back and forth until we figure out, until somebody eventually wins. Okay, so that's this model. We've talked a lot about it, and there's some other stuff I want to get to. So I'm going to not ask you how you feel about the model and talk about some crypto primitives. So first of all, I'm going to walk through a very simple description of sort of the obvious way you would apply this to compelled decryption, which is to say there is a secret password in the respondent's mind, there is a laptop in nature which has assault and ciphertext, and we know that the if you use a PBKDF on the password in the respondent's mind and the salt, we know that we will get the key that decrypts the ciphertext. Let's say we know that. But the, if the encryption scheme is good and if the password was picked with good min entropy, then if the government is able to produce a simulator that does this, then they must have either independently been able to produce the password or plain text, or they must have been able to break the encryption scheme. So the like answer to the standard question of, if everything is sort of the most obvious thing that we could do to set this up, can you compel decryption? Our model would say no. I'm going to have a discussion slide in like 3 slides where we talk about other ways this might have gone down. Also, I want to point out that sometimes it is the case that the government actually can at least know something about the plain text. So there have been cases where they have testimony from like a relative or something like that as to what is on the encrypted drive. And I'm more convinced by those sorts of cases than the other. So, okay.
Can I ask you a question about this?
Yes.
Why is it important that there's a PBKDF? Why can't the respondent just memorize the key?
They could have just memorized the key, but I thought it was more realistic that they would have only memorized the password.
It doesn't change the result.
Doesn't change the result.
Okay.
I figured if I had done that, then somebody would have been like, well, people can't actually remember, 128-bit string. Yeah, anyway. Okay, so I just said the top thing. So if you look at sort of the straightforward cases, our model would say you cannot compel decryption in these cases. Although, like I said, sometimes it is the case that the government has a different way to produce the plain text. For instance, if there was a backup encrypted under like a different key that was not just in the respondent's mind, but was in nature somewhere, for instance, like held by Apple, say. Sometimes there are, witnesses as to what the plain text would have been. And if you sort of fudge the simulator a little bit, you can say that the witness can produce the plain text. And I just want to bring up that this particular modeling composes very badly with the rest of the crypto wars. So if, for instance, there was a method for the government to get the key, for instance, by key escrow or a manufacturer device key type thing, or any of the other, compelled access sorts of questions, or not compelled access, law enforcement access types of questions that we've been asking. The government doesn't even have to do it. They just have to show that they could do it, and then they can make you decrypt it instead. So that's a funny and interesting side effect of this model, I guess, is that the rest of the crypto wars compose very badly with it. So I talked about plain text, same things with pre-images to one-way functions like hash functions. It'll often come up that somebody has a hash and they're saying, give me the file that hashed to this. Again, sometimes the government actually can produce a pre-image in the sense of, if you have a list of hashes that are known to be bad or illegal in some way, it's plausible that you could get somebody to testify to the pre-image of that hash and at least say that it was illegal, perhaps not say what the actual file was. We then go on to ask questions about, well, okay, what if the government went on to compel randomized functionalities? So this has never happened before. Like, what if the government compelled you to commit to something for some reason? Well, as far as this model is concerned, commitments are fine, hiding commitments are fine, but not decommitments, unless the original secret could also be compelled. We proved this using a composition theorem. So the above definition that I talked about composes as long as the evidence stays the same. So you can't split one compelled action into multiple smaller compelled actions and then compel them in a row to make them compellable. And similarly, you can't take several things that are foregone conclusions and make them not a foregone conclusion somehow.
Sorry, when you
Similarly,
say you
yes.
cannot take one big compelled
Yeah.
action and break it into
Yeah.
smaller actions. What do
Yeah.
you mean by cannot?
So
Sorry.
if the evidence is the same between the two actions, so if I took this compelled action on the left and I just split it into two compelled actions to be done one right after another with no changes to the evidence, it should be the case that the big compelled action is foregone if and only if the two smaller actions are also foregone.
I see. Give it where the foregoneness of the second one would be like conditioned on the output of the first or something like that.
Yes, and also, so that this is why I'm making such a big deal about the evidence. If you did
like,
one, if you did the first one, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, when you say it should be the case, that's not, you're not taking a moral position there. You're saying like mathematically it is the case, like theorem,
That's true.
it is the
Yes.
case if and only if.
Theorem statement, the big action is a foregone conclusion under this model if and only if the like two component actions are foregone conclusions. Yes, thank you. Right.
I guess there is a moral claim that like that seems like the right way that a definition should hold, right? Like a definition about the foregone conclusion doctrine should not allow the government just to break up its request into tiny pieces and push each of them individually as foregone. That's a moral claim that, I mean, it sounds like a consistency claim that seems to be what it should be. And then yes, this specific definition, you know, we can prove sequential composition in this way.
That's a good point.
Then I believe you can compel translation, by the way. As long as it's known that the person knows the language, I think.
Wait, is there a case about that?
I thought that went back to they cited it in the Burr case. I haven't read it, but I do remember them citing in the Burr case, like, well, we said the translation was okay, so isn't he just translating between the cipher space and the plain space, except they didn't call it that.
Interesting. All right.
Okay, I'm going to do a really quick run through of our other thing that we did, which is this FC resilience idea, and then we can discuss for the rest of the time. So we wanted to ask this question, which is, can we, until now, we've been talking about current compelled actions and whether or not they're compellable based on stuff that all happened in the past. And now we want to ask, I have nothing to do with any court cases, and I just want to run crypto protocols, and I want to make sure that running those crypto protocols will not open me up to future compelled requests. And I want to emphasize that this is an interesting question, even if you picked a totally different definition of foregone conclusions. So how do we define it? We say that this protocol is FC resilient if it doesn't create anything, if you can't be compelled to anything after the protocol that you weren't already compellable for before the protocol. So how do we show this? We show that everything that exists in either nature or the respondent's mind or whatever, everything that is compellable, namely is a foregone conclusion, after running the protocol, it was already foregone before running the protocol. And we do that by identifying the changes that the protocol is making to nature and showing that they were already foregone conclusions. We make one exception for when you are actively using your mind, for instance, typing your password into your laptop, and we assume that you are not compelled during that phase. And I want to first, so the first obvious objection is, well, isn't anything you do in nature already not FC resilient? And the answer is correct. Anything that you do on your laptop, while your laptop is signed in, at least, is already not FC resilient because the laptop is just there and the government could just swoop in and grab it. So all of these things are already compellable. So somehow we need to first password protect any computation that you're going to do. So that's step one. And then after we've password protected the computation you're going to do, we also need to make sure that any additional information isn't somehow leaked as part of this. So in addition to the contents of your laptop being compellable while the laptop is open at least, other things like the output of the protocol are also compellable for info about you, because the Fifth Amendment only protects you against self-incrimination, not incrimination in general. So your other NPC participants, for instance, could be compelled to provide the output. And so by participating in this NPC, if you're not okay with the output being known to the government because it reveals something about your secret, you shouldn't have participated at all. So we have this goal for NP resilient outsourced, or sorry, FC resilient outsourced NPC, whereby we want to maintain the original security guarantees of the NPC protocol, plus we want FC resilience for one party. And I don't think I have time to go into the details, so I will just provide the overall slide, which says, suppose you had a garbled circuit. Normally you would have three things. You would have a table of wire labels for yourself, a table of wire labels for the other party, and a table of like garbled gate tables. So you will continue doing the tables for the other party and the gate tables as normal, but you will self-garble your own tables, and I'll say what that means in a second. You'll self-garble your own tables, and you will also protect the output with a password. So this means that you can do all of your pre-processing, you know, the same way you did before. Self-garble your tables, which I'll describe in a second. And then you only need to use your password like once to enter your input and ungarble your tables and figure out what your input labels are. Send them to the other party. Delete everything that you had about those self-garbled tables so that you can't information about which input mapped to which cell of the table doesn't stay in nature. And then at the end, you'll get an encryption of your, I think this is supposed to say enc pbkdf of the function rather than just pbkdf of the function, although I guess it doesn't, you could implement it that way too. And the point is that you can then input your password again at the end to get the output. So, okay, I'm officially 5 minutes over time, which is 1 hour later than we started. So I can let everybody that wants to go, and anybody that wants to stay for a discussion, you are welcome to stay for a discussion. I also am going to stop recording.